To do this, we are going to follow International Master Lawrence Trent's chessable course, b6 against everything. Now, of course, it would be unethical of me, not very nice, to go through all the lines, all the details. You should go and buy the course. However, I will go through some of the popular lines according to the Elite Chess database, not go into too much detail and just explain some of the high-level ideas. And before we go ahead and just pre-move b6 and study this thing, we've got to ask the question why we would do this. And so, first of all, you'll find that playing this is completely offbeat, and so many of your opponents are going to come prepared against stuff like the French or the Scandi or the Sicilian or even the open game, the Caro Come, but very few players know what to do against b6. I reckon outside of the elite level, nobody knows the lines, and so you'll find that many of your opponents are just making stuff up. Furthermore, what you'll find is that many players don't know how to control the center. They blunder the e4 pawn. Even worse, they're not paying attention to a possible threat on the g2 pawn, and so might even lose a rook in the process. So you'll pick up your fair share of victories. And very finally, for those of you that are really skeptical, Magnus Carlsen in 2017 at the Isle of Man Masters, a classical tournament, classical, not rapid, not blitz, played b6 in a game and won. And so, quite frankly, if grandmasters are playing it, if the engine says it's okay, then it's okay. So with that, let's get started. There is a thank you button at the bottom of the video if you want to support the channel. Okay, so here we go, guys. Timestamps in the description below if you want to jump around between lines. And so in the first one, let's just do a quick visualization exercise. See if you can just picture the whole thing in your head. So it's going to be e4, b6, d4, bishop b7, knight c3, e6, knight f3, bishop b4, the e4 pawn is hanging, and now we have bishop d3, knight f6, the e4 pawn is hanging, bishop g5, and now h6 removes the bishop pair. You've seen it, right? No, let's put it up on the screen. So we have e4, b6, d4, bishop b7, knight c3, e6, knight f3, bishop b4, the e4 pawn is hanging. We have bishop to d3, knight f6, the e4 pawn is hanging. And now the third most popular move in the Elite Chess database is bishop to g5. And this practically gives up the bishop pair because we have h6. And now if the bishop decides to go back, we're going to chase it away and we're going to take this pawn. And so basically in this position, white has to give up the bishop pair and we're going to take. And of course, you're not winning, but you do get that slight positional advantage. So bishop g5 is not perhaps the best move here. A lot of players in this position are just going to push the pawn. They play e5. It's also not a great idea. You do liberate this bishop. And now we have knight to e4. And in this position, there is a threat here on c3. We have bishop to d2. We have takes. And now these are some engine lines. Bishop takes f3, g takes f3, queen h4. And in this position, black is doing really well. You've obviously got these doubled pawns here. Many players in this position will just castle for some reason. They're not paying attention to the fact that their d4 pawn is hanging, and so it's yet to be determined which side black is going to castle. So this should be a very comfortable position to play. Instead of playing e5 in this position, what you can do is to play queen e2. Perhaps this is the best thing to do. Now we have d5, and here if they take, we can take. The knight is pinned. If they castle, we can now move across. I think top players play this. You have just a normal position and it's chess from here on in. Instead, if they go ahead and play e5 in this position, we can jump here. And now after bishop d2, I think you can investigate bishop takes c3 and knight takes d2. I think these are both lines. You'll find that many people in the Elite Chess database, they just take the knight. They're scared. And this is a mistake. It's about -2, -3 on the engine. Because after d takes e4, let's say knight to g5, we have queen takes d4, we have a threat here, and black is in a completely winning position. Obviously, not trivial, but it's a good position to have. Okay, so what if they go with an early f3? So we have e4, b6, d4, bishop b7, and now f3, trying to blunt this bishop. And so what Lawrence Trent talks about in his course is striking the center with this move d5, try to break this up. And now, if they go ahead and carry on developing, let's say knight c3, popular move in the Elite Chess database, we have takes. We can strike in the center with this move e5. And now the most popular move here is d5. We have bishop b4, and this knight is pinned, and black carries this huge threat of playing queen h4 check, following up with queen takes e4, winning the rook. And so in this position, white really needs to be paying attention to this threat. Maybe knight f3 is a move. I think the engine wants you to play queen to f3, but white needs to be paying attention. Alternatively, in this position, white, many players are just going to play e5, and now we have c5 trying to break up this pawn chain. They play c3, knight c6, and this is suspiciously looking like a Khan line. Okay, so something that people are fearful of when they play these type of openings is that structures like this emerge. It turns out that against b6, a structure like this is a little bit dubious. The pawns are actually overextended here on the light squares. And so how do we get here? We have e4, b6, d4, bishop b7, and now many players trying to blunt the bishop are just going to play d5. We try to break it up with this move e6. They follow up with a move c4, bishop b4 check, and now bishop d2. Queen e7, getting ready to move the queen into enemy territory. And here, how the line should go is something like bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, the queen blocks the check, we have takes, and we have some kind of queenless middle game, endgame, slash endgame, excuse me, and it's normal chess from here on in. However, what you'll find, and what I find in many of my games, is that many players' most popular move in the Lee chess database is this move a3. This is just a mistake, because after bishop takes d2, the engine wants you to play king takes d2 because of the pin here, or the potential pin here. Of course, nobody's going to do that. And if they do, you might want to report them for cheating. And so many players in this position, they play this move queen takes d2. And now we have e takes d5. This pawn is pinned, so they take the other way. But of course, now they blunder their e4 pawn. They block the check, and they blundered their d5 pawn. And if you turn on the engine, it is about -3, -4. Not trivial, but you are in a completely winning position. And so you're going to find many games where your opponent is thinking that this structure is a good idea, but actually it's a little bit dubious. If you look in the Masters database, not many of the top players do it. Okay, so another thing they can do is to try and go for an early bishop d3 to try and protect the e4 pawn. So how do we get here? We have e4, b6, d4, bishop b7, bishop d3. Okay, previously we looked at knight c3, and in this position we have e6. And here, if they play something like knight to f3, we can just go ahead and strike in the center with d5. Many players are going to push with e5. If they takes, then I think there are a whole bunch of lines here that you can explore. But most players are going to play e5, and now you kind of have a bad bishop. And what Trent talks about in his course is to play bishop a6 and try to exchange off these light square bishops, and it's just going to be normal chess from here on in. Alternatively, in this position, c4 looks quite threatening. White appears to have amassed this enormous center, but you can undermine it with this move knight to c6, knight to c6, which is now targeting this d4 pawn, and this pretty much results in white having to give up its light square bishop, which I think is a positional gain. And so after, say, something like knight to f3, we have knight to b4, and now the bishop cannot leave to e2 because the e4 pawn is hanging. Alternatively, in this position, if they push with this move here, then I think the engine wants you to play something like knight to e5, and it still wants you to give up the bishop. If they try to move away, we can start to exert pressure on this e4 pawn. So for example, knight f6, knight c3, bishop b4, and you've got your pieces out, and it's going to be normal chess from here on in. Okay, so what if they go with the queen's pawn opening? So obviously we have d4, b6 here, and of course if they play this move e4, that just transposes into the lines that I've discussed above. Instead, in this position, many players are going to play c4, where I think the lines become quite complicated. And now after bishop b7, if they play something like d5, e6, most popular move in the Lee chess database is e4, and we transpose into some of the lines I talked about before, where these pawns are perhaps a little bit overextended. Instead, in this position, many players are going to follow up with this move knight to c3. We have e6, e4, grabbing the center. We have bishop to b4. This pawn is now hanging. Defend it with this move bishop to d3. And in this position, we can go ahead and play this move f5, which Trent talks about in his course. And here, this is a huge blunder. This basically wins the game after bishop takes g2. However, it is very double-edged. You do have to find moves, because after, say, queen h4 check, you want to figure out here what the correct move for black is. Black is winning, but what is the only move here that black can play? It is, of course, the move king to f8. You have to play this move. If you play something like g6, after takes, you lost because of, say, knight f6 trying to attack the queen. It doesn't matter because g7 is check. Okay, you can take the queen, but white is going to promote to queen anyway and take your rook in the process. And now if you turn on the engine, it's telling me here that it's about +7. And so in this position, you really have to find this move, king to f8, and black is totally winning. And so you'll find that many players actually do this. It's telling me here that some 20% of games in the Lee Chess database, excluding bullet games, go with this move, e takes f5. Instead, the most sensible thing for black to do in this position, white, is to play f3. And now we have queen h4 check, g3, queen to h5, bishop d2, knight c6, this pawn is hanging, and it's going to be chess from here on in, but it's quite a complicated position, something that you ought to study. Now there is this amazing default line where black can actually give up 2 pawns, but black is winning, but it's extremely sharp. And so we have d4, b6, c4, bishop b7, knight to c3, e6, e4, grabbing the center, bishop b4, and okay, we looked at bishop to d3 and then playing f5. An alternative in this position is if white plays this move f3, we just play f5 anyway. And now if they take, Trent talks about this move knight to h6, they take again, we have knight to f5, they take, knight takes d7, black is up, down 2 pawns. And now the most popular move in the Lee Chess database, excluding bullet chess, is queen to e2, very natural check. But amazingly, after king to f7 and the possible threat of rook to e8, remember this knight is pinned, there's a possible queen trap here. There is also queen h4 check with knight g3 tactics. And so if you actually turn on the engine in this position, despite being down 2 pawns, black is actually winning. It's about -1 according to Stockfish. Okay, so what if your opponent goes for some kingside fianchetto, playing g3, bishop to g2? In this situation, we're going to play things like e6, d5, and try to make sure there's no tactics along this diagonal. And so it's a little bit boring, but it keeps things safe. So as an example, after knight f3, b6, g3, bishop b7, bishop to g2, e6, castles, d5. Okay, and it's normal chess from here on in. You're just going to develop your pieces and try to play. Okay, so obviously a huge number of your opponents at the club level, beginner, intermediate level online, are just going to play the Collet system or the London system. And so a huge number of your games are going to go like this. And Trent talks about many possible lines that you can employ. Obviously, the London system does give black some flexibility. However, the line that I find just works, keeps things simple, is to play e6, f5 and effectively employ a kind of delayed Dutch system. And so how does it go? We have d4, b6, bishop f4, bishop b7, e3, e6, knight f3, and now f5. Seems to work for me. Engine says it's fine. We're going to play knight f6, bishop e7. We also have the opportunity to play d6 to try and control the e5 square. Now in the Collet system, this bishop is actually inside the pawn chain. And so as an example, we have d4, b6, let's say knight f3, bishop b7, e3, e6, bishop to d3, f5, castles, knight f6, knight on b to d2, bishop e7, c4, castles, and it's just normal chess. This seems to work. This seems to have no problems. I can get out the opening quite safely. So there you go, guys. Something simple and offbeat to add to your repertoire. Maybe mix things up. It's always healthy for your chess. Now, of course, you can go ahead and pre-move b6 in your online games, but never, ever, ever, guys, final tip before we go, pre-move bishop b7. Because if you do that, there were some 137,000 people in the Lee Chess database who basically played bishop a6, expecting their opponent to pre-move bishop b7. Obviously, this is a complete blunder. This is just a free piece. However, if you go into the Lee Chess database, you can see here 136,000 games, mostly going to be bullet. But amazingly, 67% of people played this move, bishop to b7. And of course, if you do that, not only have you chucked away your bishop, but you're going to chuck away your rook as well. So there you go, guys. Never, ever, ever pre-move bishop b7. Thank you very much for your time.